The mid-1970s was a defining era for organized crime in New York City, a time when powerful crime syndicates wielded influence over businesses, unions, and even city officials. The mafia had woven itself into the fabric of New York, controlling operations through a sprawling network of families and associates who ruled the streets with ruthless efficiency. It was an empire built on power, secrecy, and intimidation, and no figure embodied this more than James "Jimmy the Gent" Burke. Jimmy Burke was not a made man, as he was of Irish descent and therefore ineligible for full membership in the Italian-American mafia. Yet his sharp intelligence and calculated ruthlessness had earned him a respected position in the Lucchese crime family. Over the years, he had built a reputation as a man who got things done, a cold strategist who could charm his associates one moment and eliminate a threat the next. Burke's unofficial nickname, the Gent, was given for his habit of tipping big to avoid suspicion, but everyone knew there was nothing gentle about him. Burke's reputation for meticulous planning and unwavering loyalty to the family made him one of the most feared and trusted associates in the Lucchese network. For Burke, criminal operations were a science. He had already orchestrated numerous schemes that brought in millions, from hijacking trucks to loan sharking operations across the city. But Burke had his sights set on something far bigger, a heist so lucrative it would eclipse anything the city had ever seen. In the mid-1970s, rumors began circulating among Burke's contacts about a potentially enormous score hidden in plain sight at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Burke learned that Lufthansa, a major German airline, was transporting vast amounts of cash to the U.S. regularly. This cash, coming primarily from West Germany, represented payments made by U.S. servicemen and tourists, converted from Deutsche Marks into U.S. dollars, and left temporarily at the Lufthansa terminal before being distributed to banks across the country. The amount of cash moving through JFK was staggering. On an average day, Lufthansa alone transported around $5 million to $6 million in cash, sometimes more. Due to security lapses, much of this cash would sit in the Lufthansa cargo terminal overnight before being collected the next day by armored trucks. Burke, who had carefully studied the terminal's vulnerabilities, realized this temporary holding period presented a golden opportunity. The money was highly liquid, untraceable once in the right hands, and typically left unguarded during the late-night hours, a security flaw that few had considered exploitable. In the Lufthansa Heist, Burke saw the chance to secure his legacy. The heist was unprecedented not only in scale but also in its potential impact on the criminal underworld. If successful, it would cement Burke's reputation as one of the most daring and innovative figures in organized crime. But this heist wasn't just about wealth, it was about the power it represented. A score like this would give Burke leverage, independence, and influence over powerful players in the mafia. With his keen intellect, Burke understood that a heist of this magnitude required a masterstroke of planning and discipline, down to the smallest detail. He would need the right crew, individuals with specialized skills who were loyal, capable, and most importantly, discreet. The background of JFK Airport itself played a role in Burke's plans. Situated in Queens, JFK was one of the busiest international airports in the world, a bustling hub of cargo, cash, and precious valuables. Burke knew that the airport's security was thinly stretched, with most personnel focused on passenger safety rather than cargo. JFK was a fortress of valuables, but its weak points were readily apparent to a man of Burke's insight. By studying the airport's layout, security schedules, and employee routines, Burke identified a narrow window of opportunity where the cash would be both accessible and vulnerable. Burke's knowledge of the inner workings of JFK came from his extensive network of informants and insiders. His relationships with airport workers, guards, and even cargo handlers had been cultivated over years. These were individuals struggling with financial problems, desperate for cash, and willing to provide information in exchange for a piece of the action. Burke had quietly accumulated details about Lufthansa's shipments, schedules, and cash flow from informants, some of whom were unaware they were contributing to his grand scheme. The heist itself, however, would require someone on the inside, someone willing to take an active role. This is where Louis Werner, a Lufthansa cargo employee, entered the picture. Werner had fallen into a pit of debt, owing thousands to loan sharks. His desperation made him an easy target for Burke, who saw Werner's access to the terminal as a critical asset. Burke approached Werner through mutual connections, offering him a cut of the take in exchange for information on the cash shipments. Werner, enticed by the prospect of a life-changing score, agreed. He provided Burke with detailed schedules, security weaknesses, and insights into the routines of guards and staff. With Werner's cooperation, Burke's vision of the Lufthansa heist began to take shape. The choice of Lufthansa was not random. It was one of the few airlines that transported such large sums of untraceable cash, making it ideal for a heist where every dollar counted. Lufthansa's cash shipments were unique in their liquidity. These were bills meant for swift distribution to banks and financial institutions, and once they left the terminal, they would be nearly impossible to trace back to the heist. Burke saw this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, an enormous pile of cash sitting virtually unprotected, ripe for the taking. Burke's ambition for the Lufthansa heist wasn't without risks. He knew that pulling off a crime of this scale would bring intense scrutiny from law enforcement, but he believed that with the right plan and the right people, he could execute it cleanly, leaving no trace. He aimed for a heist so seamless that the police would be left bewildered, with nothing but rumors and speculation to go on. To achieve this, Burke would have to exercise extreme caution and discipline, and so the planning for the Lufthansa heist began in earnest. Burke kept his circle small, sharing only the most essential details with a few trusted confidants while continuing to gather information. He knew that secrecy would be key, that even the slightest leak could jeopardize the entire operation. Burke's preparations were meticulous, rooted in his understanding that every step would need to be executed flawlessly. A single mistake could unravel the entire heist. By the time he had assembled the logistics, Burke's vision for the Lufthansa heist was no longer just an idea. It was a detailed plan, refined through months of observation and strategy. This heist wasn't just about making history. It was about showing the world that Jimmy the Gent was capable of pulling off the impossible. And so the stage was set. With the groundwork in place, all that remained was assembling a crew capable of executing the plan. December's chill settled into New York City as Burke's plans for the Lufthansa heist took shape. Like a master chess player, he maneuvered each piece into place, careful and methodical. In the underworld, planning a heist of this magnitude was akin to orchestrating a symphony. Every note, every player had to be in perfect sync. For Jimmy, this wasn't just another score. This was his magnum opus, a chance to pull off the heist of the century. Burke knew that any successful operation required a crew of specialists, men who could perform their roles flawlessly without a trace of doubt or hesitation. For this, he needed a particular brand of loyalty, one born not from honor but from shared secrets and a code of silence. His first recruit was Henry Hill, a trusted associate known for his connections and the ability to fly under the radar. Henry wasn't just another guy in the mob. He was savvy, street smart, and above all, discreet. Jimmy knew that Henry's involvement would give the heist legitimacy and structure. Next was Tommy DeSimone. Tommy had a reputation that preceded him, quick-tempered and ruthless. He wasn't just an enforcer. He was a man who got things done, no questions asked. Burke knew Tommy's violent tendencies could be both a strength and a liability, but he also knew Tommy's fearlessness would be invaluable, particularly if the heist faced any unexpected complications. Tommy would be their muscle, ready to handle the rough work and intimidate anyone who got in their way. Completing the trio was Angelo Sipe, a quiet, calculating figure with nerves of steel. Angelo was the kind of man who could sit in the back of a room and blend into the shadows, unnoticed yet fully aware of everything around him. He was meticulous and efficient, with a knack for staying calm under pressure. Burke needed Angelo's steady hands and careful planning skills, especially for the delicate tasks of dismantling the security systems and ensuring that everything went off without a hitch. But the key to the entire operation lay in one man, Louis Werner, the insider. Werner was a disgraced Lufthansa cargo worker whose desperation had driven him into Burke's hands. Saddled with debts he could never repay, he was willing to risk everything for a shot at freedom. Burke played on that desperation, feeding Werner's sense of greed while subtly reminding him of the consequences of failure. Lewis knew the schedules, the security routines, and the location of the cash shipments. Without him, the heist would have been little more than a pipe dream. Together, this unlikely group formed the backbone of Burke's plan. But assembling a crew was only half the battle. The real challenge was ensuring they understood the stakes. This wasn't some small-time job, and any mistake could bring down the full weight of law enforcement and rival factions within the mob. Burke gathered the crew in a series of secret meetings, each one more intense than the last, hammering into them the importance of precision and discipline. The team was briefed down to the finest details. Jimmy walked them through the blueprint of the Lufthansa cargo terminal, pointing out the blind spots, the guard shifts, and the security systems. Every man was assigned a role. Hill would be responsible for driving and making the getaway smooth. Tommy would manage any resistance with brute force. Angelo would handle the technical elements, breaking into the secured areas. And Louis, with his insider knowledge, would guide them through the maze of cargo lockers and vaults. For weeks they went over the plan until each man could recite his duties from memory, instinctively and without question. As the date approached, Jimmy ensured that each member was in peak mental shape. Any sign of hesitation was met with a warning. In a heist like this, the smallest slip could trigger a domino effect of disaster. He made it clear that silence and loyalty were non-negotiable. To emphasize his point, he reminded them of previous associates who had been caught or had tried to talk. None had survived to tell their stories. By early December, the plan was fully in place. The crew members were instructed to go about their daily lives without any indication of what was coming. Every detail was set, from the timing of their entry to the exit route that would take them to an abandoned safe house in Queens, where they would stash the cash. Burke even coordinated an alibi for each member, making sure they would be seen in public or have credible stories in case the police came knocking after the heist. With everything in place, there was only one thing left to do: wait. The air was thick with tension, each man silently counting down the days. Burke kept a watchful eye on his crew, sensing their growing anticipation mixed with fear. He knew this job would change their lives forever if they could pull it off. And yet he also knew that in the world of organized crime, success could be as dangerous as failure. In those final days, Burke stayed quiet, a calm presence amid the chaos brewing beneath the surface. He had learned long ago that success was a double-edged sword. Money, power, respect, they were all within his reach. But at what cost? Even now he felt a strange, almost prophetic unease gnawing at him. He brushed it off, focusing instead on the thrill of the heist and the promise of an empire built on millions in untraceable cash. The team was ready. The date was set. In just a few days they would make history, or go down in flames trying. Burke's legacy, the lives of his crew, and the fate of New York's underworld all hung in the balance. The early hours of December 11th, 1978 were dark and frigid, as Jimmy Burke's crew slipped through the shadows of John F. Kennedy International Airport. By this time, the airport's activity had quieted down, and few were left in the Lufthansa cargo building. For Burke and his team, it was the ideal setup. In the dead of night, armed with insider knowledge and weeks of meticulous planning, they prepared to execute one of the largest cash thefts in American history. At precisely 3:12 a.m., Burke's men entered through a side door, a secluded entry that Louis Werner, Lufthansa's own cargo worker and Burke's inside man, had tipped them off to. Dressed in dark clothing and carrying bags and tools, the team moved quickly, each man with his specific task drilled into him through Burke's ruthless planning. First on the agenda was disabling the alarms, a job assigned to Angelo Sepe. With steady hands and a mastery of the building's security layout, Angelo neutralized the alarm system in less than 2 minutes, ensuring no alerts would reach the Port Authority or NYPD that night. With the alarm system down, the men moved deeper into the terminal, navigating a labyrinth of dimly lit hallways and quiet storage rooms. The next obstacle, the guards. Tommy DeSimone and Hill were responsible for neutralizing the staff without causing any harm. Burke had stressed that bloodshed was to be avoided at all costs. The quieter this heist, the cleaner their exit would be. As the team approached the first guard station, DeSimone moved in, his face obscured, his posture calm and collected. They quickly overpowered the guard, securing him with duct tape and escorting him to a secluded room. Each guard was similarly subdued, all bound, gagged, and left in an area far from the vault. DeSimone's reputation for violence was justified, but he followed orders to the letter, keeping his actions silent and swift, ensuring no one would sound an alarm. With the terminal secured and the guards immobilized, they reached the vault's heavy door, the final barrier between them and their prize. The Lufthansa vault was designed to secure millions in cash and valuables flown in from West Germany every week. Werner had informed them that this particular Monday night shipment held an enormous sum, roughly $5 million in unmarked bills from West Germany, intended for U.S. banks and businesses. Along with the cash, there were bags containing precious jewels valued at about $875,000. This night, the vault held over $5.875 million in cash and valuables, all ripe for the taking. The vault's lock was a formidable obstacle, but Angelo and another crew member, experienced in safe-breaking, got to work. With the aid of specialized tools and Werner's knowledge, they bypassed the security mechanism, unlocking the door in under 15 minutes. As the vault door swung open, the men found themselves staring at stacks upon stacks of bundled cash. The sheer amount was staggering, more than any of them had ever seen, enough to keep them comfortable for life. Burke's crew moved with precision, packing the bills into duffel bags and stuffing any loose valuables they found into their pockets. The cash itself was bundled neatly, organized by denomination. They worked quickly, each man filling his assigned bag without a word, their focus sharpened by the thrill of a lifetime score. In total, they loaded $5 million in cash and secured the jewelry, a total haul worth approximately $5.875 million. Within 50 minutes of entering the building, Burke's men were ready to leave. The guards remained restrained, and no one had raised the alarm. They took one last look around, ensuring no evidence was left behind. They wore gloves to avoid fingerprints, and every tool they brought in was accounted for. With bags weighing them down and hearts racing, they slipped back out the side entrance and into a waiting van parked out of sight. The drive back to the safe house was a tense one. Henry Hill was at the wheel, guiding the van along a series of back roads. They avoided major highways, navigating instead through winding residential streets to keep a low profile. No one spoke, each man processing the magnitude of what they had just done. In that van, the weight of nearly $6 million sat in silence as New York City slept, oblivious to the robbery that would soon shock the nation. By the time they arrived at the safe house in Queens, dawn was breaking. Burke's men unloaded the cash and began counting, ensuring every dollar was accounted for before hiding it. Burke himself was there, overseeing the process with a calm satisfaction that masked his underlying paranoia. He knew that a haul of this size would draw attention, and he had emphasized to his men that they were to lie low in the coming weeks. Celebrations could wait, as could spending the money. Their success depended on silence. The night after the heist, Burke and his crew were euphoric. Nearly $6 million in untraceable cash and jewels lay in their hands, the perfect heist without a single clue left behind. Burke had warned them to stay under the radar, not to spend a dime, and to act as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet the lure of millions proved too much for some. Whispers of the Lufthansa heist quickly spread through the underworld, and soon enough so did rumors of lavish spending. The larger the score, the harder it was to keep quiet. And with every rumor, Burke's confidence in his crew's loyalty began to erode. The first sign of trouble emerged with Martin Krugman, a bookie who helped coordinate certain parts of the heist and was owed a substantial share. Krugman was thrilled with the score but couldn't resist talking. He boasted to associates, letting slip enough details to risk drawing police attention. Burke heard about Krugman's loose tongue and knew he couldn't risk exposure. In mid-January 1979, Martin Krugman disappeared. He was last seen entering a restaurant in Queens, presumably for a meeting with Burke. His body was never found, but Krugman's sudden absence sent a chilling message to anyone else thinking of talking. Next, Parnell Stacks Edwards, tasked with ditching the van used in the heist, made a grave mistake. Instead of disposing of it as planned, Stacks abandoned it on a city street and proceeded to celebrate in a haze of drugs and alcohol. When the van was recovered by police, they found fingerprints that led them to question Edwards and take an interest in Burke's crew. Furious at the careless mistake, Burke decided to make an example of Stacks. In December 1978, he sent Tommy DeSimone to deal with him. Tommy tracked Stacks to his girlfriend's apartment, where he shot him, sealing his fate. The van and Stacks' fingerprints had put the crew at risk, and Burke wouldn't tolerate another misstep. As the heat from the heist intensified, Burke's paranoia deepened. He knew that the police were sniffing around, looking for any connection between his associates and the heist. His confidence in his crew was waning, especially in Angelo Sepe, who had grown increasingly reckless with his share of the money. Burke had seen Sepe making flashy purchases, going against the strict orders to lie low. Burke considered Sepe a weak link and began watching him closely. In 1979, Sepe's body turned up in a ditch in Queens. Though Burke never admitted to ordering the hit, those close to the operation knew that Sepe's fate was sealed the moment he began flaunting his newfound wealth. Burke's suspicions extended to Louis Werner, the Lufthansa insider who had provided the critical information that made the heist possible. Werner was in debt and under pressure, which had made him a valuable asset to Burke. However, Burke knew that desperate men could also be unpredictable. When the FBI began probing Lufthansa employees, Werner was one of the first they questioned. The more pressure the FBI applied, the more Burke's doubts about Werner's silence grew. In the end, Werner's survival depended on keeping his mouth shut, and though he escaped with his life, he was later convicted and sentenced to prison, paying a high price for his involvement. Richard Eaton, a known fence, met a similar fate. Eaton was supposed to help launder the cash but had delayed payments and seemed to be stalling on the agreed-upon cut. Burke, wary of anyone withholding his due, arranged a meeting with Eaton. When Eaton failed to deliver, he was found dead shortly after, his body discovered with clear signs of foul play. Burke's message was unmistakable. Loyalty was non-negotiable, and any hesitation in honoring agreements was met with swift, fatal consequences. The most shocking elimination came with Tommy DeSimone. Known for his violent temper, Tommy had been one of Burke's most trusted associates, even responsible for carrying out some of the cleanup following the heist. Yet Tommy's unpredictability was both an asset and a liability. Tommy had earned a dangerous reputation that attracted attention, especially from other families in organized crime. His impulsiveness and string of murders had finally caught up with him. When Burke received word that the Gambino family sought retribution for one of DeSimone's killings, Burke didn't intervene. In January 1979, DeSimone was last seen leaving for a meeting with the Gambino family. His disappearance was never officially connected to Burke, but insiders knew that Jimmy had sanctioned his elimination, unwilling to risk another high-profile liability. Henry Hill sat in a small, dimly lit room, his hands fidgeting nervously on the table in front of him. The decision to turn informant had not come easily. After all, he'd spent his life in the underworld, adhering to a strict code where loyalty meant everything and betrayal meant death. But as Hill weighed his options, he knew that any loyalty he felt was one-sided. Jimmy Burke, the man he'd trusted and followed for years, had turned on his crew to preserve his empire, eliminating anyone who posed even a hint of a threat. And Hill knew he could be next. In a way, Hill had no choice. Arrested on drug charges in 1980, he faced a long prison sentence, one that would be practically a death sentence if he were sent back among the inmates who had once been his comrades. The FBI, aware of the pressure mounting on Burke's circle, offered Hill a deal: his freedom in exchange for information. For Hill, it was the only path forward. He reluctantly accepted, entering a new world as a government witness, a world where protection came at the cost of leaving everything he'd ever known. When Hill began talking, the FBI listened intently, documenting each word, each detail of Burke's operations and every piece of the Lufthansa heist. Hill provided them with an inside look at one of the most complex and ambitious criminal networks in New York's history. His accounts filled in missing pieces, connecting unsolved murders, detailing illicit activities, and finally explaining how Burke had orchestrated the massive heist and its bloody aftermath. With Hill's cooperation, the FBI was able to reconstruct not only the events of the heist, but also the inner workings of Burke's criminal empire. One of the FBI's first questions was about the night of the heist itself. Hill recounted how the team had meticulously planned every detail, from disabling the alarms to binding the guards and cracking the vault. But it was what happened afterward that intrigued the agents most. They pressed Hill on Burke's actions in the days and weeks following the heist. Hill revealed how Burke's paranoia had turned deadly, leading to a series of eliminations that thinned the crew one by one. He described how Burke's fear of exposure led him to take out associates like Martin Krugman and Stax Edwards, men whose mistakes or loose lips posed a risk to Burke's empire. Hill's knowledge went beyond just the heist, however. He unraveled a web of criminal operations, from illegal gambling rings to drug trafficking, that stretched far beyond JFK Airport. The FBI was floored by the scope of Burke's reach, his influence bleeding into nearly every corner of the city. Hill's testimony also brought Burke's ruthless efficiency into stark relief. The man who had once been a trusted figure in Hill's life was now seen as a cold, calculating mastermind who would go to any lengths to protect himself. The more Hill talked, the more the FBI realized just how powerful his testimony could be. He wasn't just giving them a glimpse into Burke's operations, he was exposing the entire structure of organized crime in New York. As Hill continued, he described his personal history with Burke, how he had once admired him, seeing him as a mentor and father figure. But as he recounted the darker moments, the senseless violence and brutal executions, his admiration gave way to bitterness. Hill saw now that Burke's loyalty extended only to himself, and Hill's survival had been nothing more than luck. With Hill's revelations, the FBI constructed a damning case. Burke was soon charged on a multitude of crimes, though, ironically, never for the Lufthansa heist itself. Hill's insights helped prosecutors paint a vivid picture of Burke's activities and presented a clear pattern of violence, intimidation, and systematic crime. But as Henry Hill's role as an informant grew, so did the danger. Turning against Burke meant he was now a target, marked by the very world he had once been part of. The FBI placed him in witness protection, moving him to an undisclosed location with a new identity. For a man who had once moved freely through New York's underworld, the isolation was a kind of prison. He had swapped one life for another, gaining safety but losing the only world he had ever known. The government gave him a fresh start, but Hill quickly found that starting over wasn't so simple. He struggled with the anonymity, the quiet, the disconnect from his past. Living under a new name and a different life, he wrestled with the knowledge that he would never see his old friends, his family, or even New York City again. The cost of survival, he realized, was losing everything he once held dear. Yet even in witness protection, Hill remained restless. His notoriety and penchant for risky behavior made him a constant challenge for the agents tasked with keeping him safe. Time and again, Hill pushed boundaries, a lifetime of thrill-seeking impossible to shed. Eventually, he would go on to write about his experiences, becoming an unlikely legend and a voice for the secrets of organized crime. Though the Lufthansa heist had brought riches, it had also left a trail of betrayal, fear, and loss. For Henry Hill, surviving meant becoming a man without a past, a ghost in his own story, haunted by the choices he made and the secrets he had revealed. And as he watched Burke and the rest of his world crumble under the weight of their crimes, Hill knew that the heist had cost him everything, even as it kept him alive. But for Burke and those left behind, Hill's testimony was only the beginning of their end. The FBI now had the pieces to dismantle an empire, to take down a network of crime that had controlled New York's streets for decades. The final chapters of Jimmy Burke's reign were coming, each piece of evidence bringing him closer to his inevitable fall. And as Hill continued to talk, one question lingered. Would Burke's legacy be the heist, or the deadly betrayal of those who had dared to trust him? When Henry Hill took the stand, the courtroom filled with a mix of anticipation and dread. This trial wasn't just about Burke and his associates. It was a public unveiling of organized crime's shadowy empire. Hill's testimony, supported by carefully gathered evidence, provided the FBI with an arsenal of damning details that dismantled Burke's criminal world piece by piece. The Lufthansa heist itself was a masterpiece of crime, a well-coordinated military-style operation that had gone unsolved for years. But while Hill's testimony finally lifted the veil on the heist, the FBI knew they needed more to make charges stick in court. Armed with information from Hill, investigators traced a web of illegal activities that spanned drug trafficking, loan sharking, extortion, and violent crimes dating back decades. Hill's testimony wasn't just about the heist, it was about Burke's role in orchestrating a sprawling criminal network that went far beyond JFK Airport. The trials that followed were grueling, with Hill and other informants revealing the inner workings of the mob in excruciating detail. Hill recounted Burke's growing paranoia following the heist. His methodical elimination of associates he believed posed a risk. From Martin Krugman's disappearance to the violent fate of Stax Edwards, Hill's accounts linked Burke to the chilling post-heist cleanup that had left authorities baffled and terrified. But Burke, ever the master manipulator, maintained his innocence throughout. In court he appeared calm, even charming, as he denied any connection to the heist or the deaths of his associates. Burke's defense team worked tirelessly, painting him as a respectable businessman, a mere scapegoat in a crime he had no part in. Despite their efforts, the evidence mounted, and Hill's testimony provided a clear picture of a man who would stop at nothing to protect his empire. The FBI used Hill's detailed descriptions to strengthen their case. From bank records showing suspicious transactions to testimonies linking Burke to multiple racketeering operations, the evidence became overwhelming. Hill's accounts were particularly instrumental in connecting Burke to criminal operations beyond Lufthansa. He exposed loan sharking rings, illegal gambling establishments, and an extensive drug operation that fed New York's seedy underbelly. By the time the trial concluded, Hill had laid out a career's worth of criminal enterprise that painted Burke as one of the most ruthless figures in organized crime. Public fascination with the trial grew with each revelation, and media coverage exploded. People across America were captivated by the high-stakes drama unfolding in the courtroom. The Lufthansa heist had already become the stuff of legend, but seeing the man allegedly behind it exposed to the public elevated it to a near-mythic level. Journalists lined the courtroom, documenting every detail, and the public's curiosity about the mafia and organized crime grew insatiable. Books, articles, and later films were inspired by these events, cementing Burke and the heist into American crime lore. But despite Hill's critical testimony, the prosecution faced a peculiar challenge. Charging Burke directly for the Lufthansa heist was nearly impossible. The heist itself left little physical evidence, and the planning was meticulous enough that only testimony tied him to it. Without concrete proof, the prosecutors turned to the rest of Burke's operations. Instead, they focused on racketeering, extortion, drug trafficking, and violent crimes that Hill and other informants connected to Burke. These charges painted a comprehensive picture of his criminal empire, one built on fear, loyalty, and systematic violence. Ultimately, Burke was convicted not for the Lufthansa heist, but for charges that stemmed from Hill's accounts of his other criminal activities. The racketeering charges alone carried hefty sentences, and Burke was handed a 20-year sentence in 1982. Over time, additional charges compounded his time in prison, amounting to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In 1996, Burke died in prison, a man whose empire had crumbled around him, leaving him isolated in the cell he would never leave. As for Henry Hill, life after the trial was a strange new reality. His decision to cooperate with law enforcement had severed him from his former life, turning him into a man forever looking over his shoulder. As part of the plea deal, Hill was enrolled in the Witness Protection Program, relocated to small nondescript towns, given a new name, and tasked with creating a life under the radar. But Hill found it nearly impossible to stay out of trouble. The habits he'd developed in the criminal underworld, reckless spending, substance abuse, and thrill-seeking, continued to follow him, creating challenges for his handlers in the FBI. Despite the FBI's efforts, Hill's struggle with addiction and a string of minor arrests made him a liability in the Witness Protection Program. Eventually, he was expelled from the program, left to fend for himself as a marked man. In a twist of irony, Hill used his infamy to fuel a new chapter of life, capitalizing on the notoriety of his criminal past. His life story was immortalized in books, interviews, and eventually the iconic film Goodfellas*, making Hill a figure as legendary as Burke himself. Hill's accounts of the Lufthansa heist and the organized crime world he inhabited left an indelible mark on American culture. The trial had ended and the convictions were secured, But the story of Burke, Hill, and the Lufthansa heist lingered in the public imagination, a chilling reminder of the dangers, betrayals, and consequences that lurk beneath the allure of crime. But for the FBI, the case was far from closed. Hill's testimony and the revelations it brought to light led them to new figures, new leads, and a deeper understanding of the mafia's structure, a web that extended far beyond Burke's empire. Hill may have walked away, but the echoes of the Lufthansa heist rippled outward, unraveling secrets that would haunt the criminal underworld for years to come.